The Valorian Dominion had conquered 17 star systems in less than 100 years, and their reputation spread across the galaxy like a plague that no species could escape from. For they were known as the most brutal and efficient conquerors the universe had ever seen, and every civilization that stood against them had fallen into dust. And Memory Commander Zethral stood on the bridge of his flagship, the eternal silence, watching the stars drift past the massive observation windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, and his pale gray skin reflected the dim blue light of the holographic displays that surrounded him on all sides. Like a cocoon of information and power, he was tall even by Valorian standards, standing nearly 8 feet with long limbs and fingers that ended in sharp points, and his eyes held no warmth or compassion because such emotions had been bred out of his species thousands of years ago when they decided that feelings were weaknesses that needed to be eliminated. "Commander," his tactical officer called out from across the bridge, "we are approaching the border of the restricted zone that the Galactic Council has marked as forbidden territory." Zethral turned slowly and looked at the star chart floating in the center of the room, where a large red boundary line separated known space from the region that every species in the galaxy avoided like it was cursed by ancient gods. "The dead zone," he whispered, and the words carried a hint of amusement that surprised even himself. "Tell me again why we have avoided this sector for so long." The tactical officer shifted uncomfortably before responding. "Sir, in the last 60 years, 47 ships from various species have crossed into this region, and not a single one has ever returned or sent any communication back to their homeworlds." "No distress signals at all?" Zethral asked with genuine curiosity. "None, Commander, and no debris has ever been found either." As if the ships simply vanished into nothing the moment they crossed the border. Zethral walked closer to the star chart and studied the empty region with his sharp eyes, and he noticed that it contained at least a dozen star systems that could hold valuable resources and habitable planets worth conquering. "What do we know about the species that lives in this space?" he demanded. "They call themselves humans, sir, and our intelligence reports suggest they have only been capable of interstellar travel for approximately 300 years, which makes them one of the youngest spacefaring species in the known galaxy." The commander let out a sound that might have been laughter if Valorians were capable of such expressions. 300 years is nothing compared to our 10,000 years of dominance. So how could such primitive creatures pose any threat to our mighty fleet? He gestured toward the 40 warships that traveled in perfect formation behind his flagship, each one capable of destroying entire planets and carrying thousands of soldiers who knew nothing but war and conquest. "The High Council has authorized this invasion," Zethral announced to his crew, "and we will claim these human territories for the Dominion and add another species to our collection of slaves. So prepare all ships to cross the border immediately." The order was transmitted across the fleet, and one by one, the massive warships accelerated toward the invisible line that separated the known galaxy from the mysterious region that had swallowed so many vessels before them as they crossed the threshold into human space. Zethral felt a strange sensation crawl up his spine, something he had not experienced in centuries of warfare and conquest, and he realized with sudden clarity that the feeling was uncertainty. The first hour passed without incident, and then the second and third hours came and went with nothing but empty space and distant stars filling their sensors. And the crew began to relax as they realized that perhaps the stories about this region were nothing more than superstition and fear. But Zethral remained alert, standing motionless on his bridge while his officers went about their duties with growing confidence. And he watched the sensor displays with an intensity that bordered on obsession. "Commander, we are detecting no ships, no stations, no outposts, and no signs of any civilization whatsoever," the sensor officer reported with confusion in his voice. That is impossible, Zethral replied sharply. A species capable of interstellar travel must have some presence in their own territory. So keep scanning and find them millions of miles away. On a small moon, orbiting the third planet of a yellow star system, Lieutenant Daniel Morrison sat in a cramped observation post surrounded by screens and instruments that monitored every corner of human space. He was young, barely 30 years old, with short brown hair and tired eyes that came from too many long shifts watching empty space for threats that rarely materialized. But today was different because today the alarms had finally sounded. Control. This is Luna Station 7. He spoke calmly into his headset while sipping coffee from a worn ceramic mug. We have confirmed contact with hostile vessels that have crossed into our territory, and I am counting 40 warships of unknown configuration heading toward the inner systems. A voice crackled back through his earpiece. Luna 7, we have confirmed your report, and Admiral Price has been notified of the situation. So maintain observation and await further instructions. Then Daniel leaned back in his chair and watched the red dots on his screen that represented the alien fleet moving deeper into human space. And he felt no fear or panic because he had trained for this moment his entire adult life, 3 miles beneath the Rocky Mountains on Earth, in a bunker that had been built to survive the end of the world itself. Admiral Catherine Price stood before a wall of screens that showed everything happening in human space. She was 58 years old, with silver hair cut short and practical, and her eyes were the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes. Cold and calculating, and filled with a quiet fury that she kept carefully controlled at all times. 40 ships, she said quietly to herself as she studied the data streaming across her displays. The Valorians finally decided to test us after all these years of watching and waiting. Her aide approached nervously and asked, Admiral, what are your orders? Should we attempt communication or prepare defensive positions around the inner colonies? Catherine Price turned to face him with an expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts. And she considered the question for exactly 4 seconds before making a decision that would change the course of galactic history forever. Neither. She replied with absolute certainty in her voice. We gave them a chance to stay out of our space, and they chose to ignore every warning we sent. So now they will learn why no ship has ever returned from crossing our borders. She walked to the central command console and placed her hand on the activation panel that connected her to every military installation in human territory. Wake them up, she ordered. All of them, across human space, in asteroid fields and hidden stations and ships that floated silently in the darkness between stars. Lights began to flicker on, and engines began to hum with power that had been sleeping for decades. And humanity prepared to welcome its unwanted guests in a way that no alien species had ever experienced before. The Valorian fleet continued its advance through human space for 6 hours without encountering any resistance. And with each passing moment, Commander Zethral grew more uneasy as his sensors showed nothing but empty void and silent stars that seemed to watch them with invisible eyes. This is wrong, he muttered to himself while pacing the bridge of the eternal silence. No species simply abandons their own territory when invaders arrive. So where are they hiding and what are they planning? His communications officer suddenly looked up from her station with confusion written across her gray features. Commander, I am detecting strange electromagnetic pulses coming from multiple directions, but they disappear before I can trace their source. What kind of pulses? Zethral demanded as he strode toward her station. Unknown. Sir, they do not match any technology in our database, and they seem to be scanning our ships without triggering our defensive sensors, which should be impossible according to everything we know about physics. Before Zethral could respond, Every light on every ship in the entire fleet went dark simultaneously, and the hum of engines and life support systems fell silent, as if someone had simply reached out and turned off the power to 40 warships at once. Emergency lighting flickered on after a few terrifying seconds, casting blood-red shadows across the faces of crew members who had never experienced fear until this moment. And Zethral gripped the railing of his command platform with enough force to bend the metal beneath his fingers. "What happened?" he roared into the darkness. "Get me answers immediately, or I will execute every officer on this bridge." His engineers scrambled to their stations and began running diagnostics while the rest of the crew stood frozen in place. And the silence that filled the ship was more terrifying than any battle they had ever fought. Then, a voice spoke through every speaker on every ship in the fleet. Calm and measured and speaking perfect Valorian, as if the speaker had studied their language for years. "You have entered sovereign human territory without authorization, and this is your first and only warning to turn back now." Zethral felt his blood run cold as the voice continued. "If you choose to leave immediately, you will be permitted to return to your own space without harm. But if you continue forward, you will not return at all, and your names will be forgotten by history itself." The transmission ended, and power slowly returned to the fleet as systems rebooted and engines hummed back to life. And the crew looked to their commander with desperation in their eyes as they waited for him to tell them what to do. Zethral stood tall and forced himself to show no weakness in front of his subordinates, even though something deep inside him screamed that they should turn around and flee while they still could. That was nothing but a trick, he declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. "These humans are clearly more advanced than we expected, but no species in the galaxy can stand against the Dominion when we bring our full power to bear." He pointed toward the distant stars ahead and commanded, "Continue forward and prepare all weapons for combat, because we will show these primitives what happens when they dare to threaten the greatest military force the universe has ever known." The fleet pressed onward with renewed determination, and Zethral watched the sensor displays with obsessive attention as they approached the fourth planet of the system, a barren rock with no atmosphere and no strategic value. But as they passed the dark side of that dead world, something emerged from the shadows that made every Valorian on the bridge freeze in absolute terror. A single ship appeared on their sensors, perhaps 1/10 the size of a Valorian cruiser, and it moved with a grace and precision that seemed impossible for any vessel to achieve, gliding through space like a predator that had finally spotted its prey. "One ship?" Zethral said with disbelief, and then he laughed, because surely the humans could not be so foolish as to send a single vessel against 40 warships. "Destroy it immediately and show them the price of their arrogance." His weapons officer fired the main cannon, sending a beam of pure destructive energy toward the human ship that should have vaporized it in an instant. But what happened next defied everything the Valorians understood about space combat. The human ship did not dodge or retreat or try to shield itself from the attack, but instead it simply moved through the beam as if the deadly energy was nothing more than light and shadow, emerging on the other side completely unharmed. "Impossible," the weapons officer whispered. "That blast should have destroyed a ship 10 times its size. So how did it survive without even a scratch?" Before anyone could answer, the human ship vanished from their sensors completely, and for a terrible moment, the Valorians thought it had been destroyed after all. Then it reappeared directly behind the fleet, positioned perfectly between the rearmost warships as if it had always been there, and it hung motionless in space like a silent judge watching criminals await their sentence. Captain Ryan Torres sat in the cockpit of the USS Nightfall, his hands resting lightly on the controls while holographic displays surrounded him with information about the alien fleet he had been sent to. He was 35 years old, with dark hair and eyes that had seen too many training. simulations to be surprised by anything the universe could throw at him. And he watched the Valorian ships with the calm patience of a hunter who knew his prey had no chance of escape. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Megan Santos, ran calculations on her display and reported, "They are confused and scared," which is exactly what Admiral Price predicted would happen when they realized their weapons were useless against our technology. "Good," Ryan replied without taking his eyes off the alien fleet. "Fear is the first step toward wisdom, and these Valorians have a lot of learning to do before this day is over. Should we engage them now or wait for the rest of the fleet to arrive?" Megan asked while checking their weapon systems that hummed with quiet power. Ryan shook his head slowly. "Our orders are to observe and demonstrate, not to attack, because the Admiral wants them to understand exactly what they are facing before we reveal our full strength on the eternal silence." Zethral stared at the sensor display showing the human ship behind his fleet, and he felt something he had never experienced in his entire military career. The cold certainty that he had made a terrible mistake. "All ships, target that vessel and fire everything we have," he screamed, and 40 warships turned their weapons toward the tiny human craft, the space around the USS. Nightfall erupted with weapons fire as hundreds of beams and missiles converged on its position, creating a storm of destruction that should have reduced any ship to atoms. But when the light faded and the sensors cleared, the human vessel remained exactly where it had been, completely untouched. And now it was moving toward the eternal silence with deliberate slowness. "How is this possible?" Zethral whispered as he watched the impossible ship approach. "What are these creatures? And what have we awakened by crossing into their territory?" Ryan Torres guided the Nightfall past the alien flagship, close enough that the Valorians could see his ship through their observation windows. And he made sure they got a good look at the sleek black hull that reflected no light and the weapons that glowed with energy they could not comprehend. "Message delivered," he said quietly to himself. "Now they know we are here, and soon they will learn just how badly they have miscalculated." He pulled the Nightfall away from the fleet and vanished into the darkness once more, leaving the Valorians to contemplate their situation and wonder what other horrors awaited them in the depths of human space. What Commander Zethral and the entire Valorian Dominion failed to understand was the history that had shaped humanity into what they had become. A history written in blood and fire, and suffering that no alien species had ever endured or could ever truly comprehend. 300 years before the Valorian fleet crossed into human space, Earth had been dying a slow and terrible death that seemed impossible to stop. And the human race had stood at the edge of complete extinction with no hope of salvation in sight. Climate had collapsed after centuries of neglect and abuse, turning fertile lands into deserts and flooding coastal cities that had stood for thousands of years. And billions of people found themselves without homes or food or any reason to believe tomorrow would be better than today. Then the resource wars began, as nations fought each other for the last scraps of clean water and arable land. And weapons that should never have been used were deployed against civilian populations who had done nothing wrong except live in the wrong place at the wrong time. And just when humanity thought things could not possibly get worse, a pandemic emerged from the chaos and spread across the globe with terrifying speed, killing 2 billion people in 18 months and leaving the survivors to bury their dead in mass graves that stretched for miles. The generation that witnessed these horrors made a decision that would echo through the centuries that followed, a promise written in the ashes of their destroyed civilization and sealed with the tears of every parent who had lost a child to war or disease or starvation. Never again. They swore to themselves and each other, and they meant it with every fiber of their being. The survivors rebuilt their world from nothing, working together in ways that previous generations would have thought impossible, putting aside old hatreds and national borders to focus on a single goal that united all of humanity under one purpose. They would become so strong that nothing in the universe could ever threaten their existence again. Not nature or disease, or any enemy that might emerge from the darkness between the stars. Every resource was poured into science and technology and defense. And the greatest minds of each generation dedicated their lives to creating weapons and shields and engines that pushed the boundaries of what physics allowed by the time humanity achieved faster than light travel and ventured out into the galaxy. They had already developed technologies that made them the most advanced species in existence, though they kept this fact carefully hidden from the alien civilizations they encountered. They built weapons that could crack planets in half, and shields that could withstand the heat of stars. And they created cloaking systems that bent light itself to hide their ships from any sensor ever invented. But more importantly, they learned something from their near extinction that no amount of technology could replace. And that lesson was restraint. Admiral Catherine Price understood this history better than most, because her family had lived through every chapter of humanity's darkest era and survived to tell the tale. Her great-grandmother had been a doctor during the pandemic, working 20-hour shifts in makeshift hospitals while watching patients die faster than she could treat them. And she had written letters to her family describing horrors that still haunted the Price family 3 generations later. Her grandfather had helped build the first interstellar defense grid, spending 40 years in deep space stations, designing the systems that would protect humanity from any threat the universe could produce. And he had died knowing that his work would keep his descendants safe for centuries to come. Catherine carried their memories with her every day, and she had sworn the same oath that every human military officer swore upon taking command. The promise that humanity would never again be caught unprepared or vulnerable. She stood in her bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains and watched the Valorian fleet on her screens. And she felt no anger or hatred toward the aliens who had invaded her territory, only a cold determination to teach them a lesson they would never forget. Admiral, her aide reported nervously, Captain Torres has completed his demonstration, and the alien fleet appears to be continuing forward despite everything they witnessed. Of course they are, Catherine replied with something that might have been sadness in her voice. Species like the Valorians do not understand anything except force, so they will keep pushing until we show them exactly what they are dealing with. She turned to face her command staff, men and women who had trained their entire lives for this moment, and she saw no fear in their eyes, because humans had forgotten how to be afraid a long time ago. For 50 years, we have watched the Valorian Dominion conquer and enslave and destroy, she said in a voice that carried across the silent room. We have documented every atrocity they committed and every civilization they crushed beneath their boots, waiting for the day when they would be foolish enough to cross our borders. Her hands moved across the command console, activating systems that had been sleeping since before she was born. Today is that day, and we will show them why every ship that entered human space never returned to tell the tale. Across the vastness of human territory, ships that had been hidden for decades began to emerge from their hiding places, rising from asteroid fields and drifting away from stations that looked abandoned but were actually filled with advanced technology. The fleet that humanity had built was not designed for conquest or glory, but for one purpose only: to ensure that no threat to human existence would ever succeed. Lieutenant Commander Nathan Brooks commanded one of the larger vessels, a cruiser called the Silent Judgment that could match any 10 Valorian warships in combat. And he watched his crew prepare for battle with quiet pride. All systems are online and ready, his tactical officer reported. The alien fleet is surrounded, though they do not appear to realize it yet. Nathan nodded slowly and replied, They will realize it soon enough, and when they do, They will understand that they made the worst mistake in the history of their species. He thought about his own family, his wife and 2 children who lived on a colony world in the outer systems. And he remembered why he had joined the military in the first place, not for glory or adventure, but to protect the people he loved from anything that might threaten them, just as his ancestors had protected their families during the darkest days of human history. Maintain position and wait for the Admiral's command, he ordered his crew. We move when she tells us to move, and not a moment before. The human fleet hung in the darkness like silent ghosts, invisible to Valorian sensors and patient as only a species that had survived extinction could be, waiting for the moment when they would reveal themselves and change the course of galactic history forever in her bunker on Earth. Admiral Price watched the final pieces move into position, and she allowed herself a small smile that held no warmth or joy. Phase 2, she ordered. Show them what humanity has become. The Valorian fleet was surrounded before Commander Zethral even realized they were under attack. And the moment of revelation came not with explosions or weapons fire, but with a simple shift in reality that made his blood freeze and his vein ships emerge from what had appeared to be empty space, materializing out of nothing like ghosts becoming solid. And they were everywhere at once. Dozens and then hundreds of human vessels appearing in perfect formation around the invading fleet. Where did they come from? Zethral screamed at his sensor officers, who stared at their displays with expressions of pure terror that no Valorian had shown in thousands of years of conquest. Unknown. Commander, one of them stammered in response. They were not there a moment ago, and now they are surrounding us on all sides. And our sensors cannot even tell us how many ships we are facing because their technology is completely invisible to everything we have. The human vessels moved with impossible precision, coordinating their movements without any detectable communications, as if they shared a single mind that controlled them all. And they began to form a perfect sphere around the Valorian fleet, like a cage made of starlight and death. Zethral watched the tactical display as red icons representing human ships multiplied across the screen, and he realized with growing horror that his fleet of 40 warships was now outnumbered by at least 10 to 1. All ships, prepare for combat, he commanded, though his voice cracked with an emotion he refused to acknowledge. We are the Dominion, and we do not surrender to any enemy. So prepare to fight your way through these humans and prove our superiority. But before any Valorian weapon could fire, every view screen on every ship in the fleet flickered to life with a new transmission. And the face that appeared made Zethral understand just how badly he had miscalculated Admiral Catherine. Price looked at him through the screen with eyes that held no warmth or mercy, and her silver hair framed a face that seemed carved from stone, showing no emotion except cold certainty. Commander Zethral of the Valorian Dominion, she said in a voice that carried across every ship simultaneously, I know who you are and what your people have done, because we have been watching you for 50 years. She paused to let her words sink in before continuing. Every world you burned, every species you enslaved, every innocent life you took for your own twisted glory. We documented all of it and waited for the day when you would be foolish enough to give us a reason to act. Zethral tried to respond, but his voice caught in his throat as the human admiral continued her speech. We gave you a warning when you entered our space, a chance to turn back and leave in peace, but you chose to ignore it and continue your invasion. And that choice has consequences that you are about to learn firsthand. The transmission ended, and the human ships began to move inward, slowly tightening the sphere around the Valorian fleet like a noose being drawn around the neck of a condemned criminal. Fire! Zethral screamed, finally finding his voice. All ships fire everything we have and break through their formation. The space around the Valorian fleet erupted with weapons fire as 40 warships unleashed their full destructive power against the surrounding human vessels. Beams of energy and missiles and projectiles, filling the void with light and fury. But every shot was absorbed by shields that glowed briefly before returning to invisibility, or deflected by systems that bent the energy away harmlessly, or simply missed as human ships danced between the attacks with movements that seemed to mock the laws of physics. Not a single human vessel was damaged, and not a single Valorian weapon found its mark. Lieutenant Kevin Park commanded one of the smaller interceptors in the human fleet, a ship called the Swift Justice that was built for speed and precision rather than raw firepower. And he guided his vessel through the chaos with a smile on his young face. Target the engines on the third cruiser and disable their propulsion systems, he ordered his weapons officer. Remember our orders. We cripple, but we do not kill. Not yet anyway. His ship darted toward the Valorian cruiser like a hawk diving toward its prey, weaving between weapons fire that could not track its movements. And it fired a single precise shot that struck the alien vessel's engine compartment. The cruiser went dark as its propulsion systems failed, leaving it drifting helplessly while the battle raged around it. And Kevin was already moving toward his next target before the Valorians could even understand what had happened across the sphere of human ships. Similar scenes played out as vessel after vessel disabled Valorian warships without destroying them, using surgical strikes to remove weapons and engines, while leaving life support and crew quarters intact. Commander Zethral watched his fleet being dismantled piece by piece, and he felt despair settle into his chest like a weight that would never be lifted, because he finally understood what he was facing. These humans were not just more advanced than the Dominion. They were operating on a level of technology and tactics that made his people look like primitives throwing rocks at the stars. Why do they not destroy us? He asked no one in particular. His voice hollow and broken, his tactical officer responded with fear trembling in every word. I do not know, Commander. They could have annihilated our entire fleet in the first minute of contact. But instead they are deliberately keeping us alive while removing our ability to fight. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted less than 2 hours, and when it ended, every Valorian ship floated helplessly in the void, their weapons destroyed and their engines disabled. Completely at the mercy of the human fleet, Admiral Price appeared on the view screens once more, and Zethral noticed that her expression had not changed at all during the entire engagement, showing the same cold certainty as before. Your fleet is disabled, she stated as if commenting on the weather. Your weapons are destroyed, your engines are offline, and your shields have been completely neutralized, leaving you with no ability to fight or flee. She leaned closer to the screen, and something flickered in her eyes that might have been anger held carefully in check. You came here to conquer and enslave, just as you have done to so many other species. But you found something different waiting for you in human space. Zethral found his voice and asked a question that burned in his mind. What are you going to do with us? Will you execute us as we have executed so many others? Admiral Price shook her head slowly, and her answer surprised him more than anything else that had happened since they crossed the border. No, she said quietly. We are not going to kill you, Commander. Because humanity learned long ago that becoming monsters to defeat monsters only creates more darkness in the universe. She straightened in her chair and continued. We are going to send you home, so that you can deliver a message to your High Council and everyone else in the Dominion about what happened here today. Commander Zethral stared at the view screen in disbelief, unable to comprehend the words that Admiral Catherine Price had just spoken. Because no species in the history of the galaxy had ever defeated an enemy so completely and then chosen to let them go free. You are releasing us? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper that carried across the silent bridge of the eternal silence. Yes, the human admiral confirmed without any trace of humor or deception in her tone. We are going to repair your engines, just enough to allow you to limp back to your own territory. Though your weapons will remain disabled, and your shields will stay offline for the entire journey. But why would you do this? Zethral demanded, confusion overwhelming his fear. You have us completely at your mercy, and you could destroy the entire Dominion if you wanted to. So why would you let us leave when we came here to conquer your people? Admiral Price was silent for a long moment before answering, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 3 centuries of human history and suffering. Because we know what you are, she said quietly. You are conquerors and slavers and destroyers. And you believe that power gives you the right to take whatever you want from those weaker than yourselves. She stood from her command chair and walked closer to the screen, her eyes never leaving the Valorian commander's face. 300 years ago, humanity nearly destroyed itself through war and greed and hatred. And we learn from that experience what happens when a species believes that might makes right. Her voice grew harder as she continued. We could have used our technology to conquer the galaxy 100 times over, to enslave every species we encountered, and build an empire that would make your Dominion look like children playing with toys. But we chose not to, she declared with absolute conviction, because we understood that the easy path leads to ruin, and that becoming what we despise would destroy everything that makes us human. Zethral struggled to understand her words, because they contradicted everything his species had believed for 10,000 years. Then what do you want from us? If not conquest or revenge or domination? Admiral Price returned to her chair and sat down with the calm confidence of someone who held all the power in the universe. We want you to understand something, Commander, and I want you to carry this understanding back to your High Council and every citizen of your Dominion. She leaned forward and spoke slowly, making sure every word was heard clearly across every Valorian ship. You are alive because we allow it. Your Dominion exists because we permit it. And every world you have conquered remains under your control only because we have chosen not to interfere until now. Her eyes seemed to burn with cold fire as she delivered her final message. Cross into our space again, and we will not show this restraint. We will come to your worlds and free every species you have enslaved. We will dismantle everything you have built and scatter your fleets across the void. And we will do it so quickly and so completely that the galaxy will forget your name within a generation. The transmission ended, leaving the Valorian crews in stunned silence as they contemplated the fate they had narrowly avoided and the warning that had been burned into their memories. True to her word, Admiral Price had human engineers board each Valorian vessel to repair their engines, just enough to make the journey home possible. Though the work was done under heavy guard and with weapons that could vaporize any ship that showed signs of resistance, Commander Zethral watched the humans work on his flagship, noticing how they moved with efficiency and discipline that matched any Valorian soldier. And he realized that these people had been preparing for war far longer than his species had been aware of their existence. Journey home took 3 months. 3 terrible months of traveling through hostile space with no weapons and no shields and no ability to defend themselves against anything that might attack them. Along the way, every moment of that journey was filled with the constant awareness that death could come at any time from any direction, and the Valorian crews lived in a state of perpetual fear that none of them had ever experienced before, but nothing attacked them, because the humans had made sure that every species in the region knew the Valorian fleet was to be left alone, allowing their enemies to return home and deliver their message. When Zethral finally reached the Dominion capital and stood before the High Council to deliver his report, he found that words failed him for the first time in his military careers. The counselors sat in their ornate chamber, surrounded by trophies from 1,000 conquered worlds, and they looked at their greatest commander with expectations of glory and triumph in their eyes. Tell us of your victory, the senior counselor demanded. Tell us what new territories you have claimed for the Dominion and what slaves you have brought back to serve our people. Zethral stood in the center of the chamber and felt the weight of everything he had. Witness pressing down on his shoulders like the gravity of a dying star. There was no victory, he said in a voice that echoed through the suddenly silent chamber. There was only defeat, and a lesson that we must learn if we wish to survive. He described everything that had happened, from the moment they crossed the border to the final message from Admiral Price. And he watched the expressions of the counselors change from confusion to disbelief to terror as they understood the truth. These humans are not like any species we have ever encountered, Zethral concluded. They possess technology beyond our understanding and power beyond our ability to resist. But more than that, they possess restraint that prevented them from destroying us when they had every right to do so. One of the counselors scoffed despite the fear in his eyes. Then, what do you suggest we do? Surely, we cannot simply accept defeat and do nothing. Zethral looked at the star chart on the wall, where the region of human space was now marked in red as a zone of absolute danger. And he spoke the words that would change Valorian policy forever. We leave them alone, he said with absolute certainty. We never cross their borders again. We never threaten their people. And we never give them a reason to come for us, because if we do, everything we have built will be reduced to ashes and memories. The High Council debated for days. But in the end, they accepted Zethral's recommendation, because even the proudest Valorian could understand when an enemy was simply too powerful to challenge, and for the next 1,000 years, the Valorian Dominion kept its distance from human space, never crossing the border, never testing the humans, never forgetting the lesson they had learned far away in orbit around Neptune. Captain Ryan Torres docked the USS Nightfall at a station that looked out over the blue planet and the distant sun beyond and Lieutenant Megan Santos walked to the observation deck, where Earth hung like a jewel against the endless darkness of space. And they stood in comfortable silence as they watched their homeworld shine with life and hope. Do you think they will ever come back? Megan asked quietly. Ryan shook his head slowly. No, they got the message loud and clear. And even if their pride makes them want revenge, their fear will keep them away. And if some other species decides to try their luck? He smiled, a tired but genuine expression that reflected the quiet confidence of his people. Then we will be ready for them too, because that is what humanity does. He turned to look at his co-pilot with warmth in his eyes. We survive, we adapt, we grow stronger, and we protect our own, no matter what the universe throws at us. Behind them, the lights of the station hummed with the power of a civilization that had walked through fire and emerged stronger than ever before. And humanity continued its eternal watch over the darkness between the stars, ready for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring.